March 12, 1943. Interstate 80 construction site, Nevada. Temperature dropping toward freezing as another supply convoy limps into Reno, with half its original cargo scattered across 200 miles of desert highway. 23 trucks had departed Sacramento loaded with critical construction materials for America's first transcontinental superhighway. 11 trucks arrived intact. The mathematics of wartime logistics were brutally simple. Every lost shipment meant delayed construction schedules that pushed America's strategic infrastructure months behind German Autobahn development. Every hijacked trailer represented materials that would never reach defense plants operating around the clock to meet production quotas that seemed impossible even with unlimited resources. Frank Morrison stood beside his battered Kenworth watching steam rise from an overheated radiator, while his dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio with news that made his jaw clench. 3 more convoys hit between here and Salt Lake City. Cargo losses approaching 60% on the central route. The voice carried the weary resignation of someone who had watched America's supply chain hemorrhage efficiency, while enemy submarines dominated Atlantic shipping lanes and domestic trucking operations struggled against organized theft rings that operated with military precision. At 34, Morrison possessed the methodical intelligence of a man who understood that successful trucking demanded more than driving skill. Wire-rimmed glasses perched precisely on his weathered face, logbook never far from his calloused hands. Behind him, scattered across Nevada's windswept landscape, lay the wreckage of conventional convoy tactics that transportation experts across America had elevated to gospel truth. Single-file formation maintaining visual contact between vehicles, radio silence to prevent enemy intercept, predetermined routes published through official channels that reached every dispatcher from coast to coast. The telegram that would change everything had arrived 48 hours earlier from the War Production Board in Washington. Critical materials shortage threatening Pacific theater supply operations. Immediate improvement in domestic transportation efficiency required or strategic production goals will not be met. The stakes couldn't be higher. Boeing needed aluminum for B-17 production. Shipyards demanded steel for Liberty ship construction. But none of that mattered if trucking companies couldn't deliver raw materials through territory controlled by organized theft rings that intercepted convoy schedules like enemy intelligence operations. Morrison had heard this song before. Across America's transportation industry, conventional wisdom flowed like doctrine from loading dock to corporate boardroom. Convoy security meant traveling together for mutual protection. Radio discipline prevented enemy surveillance. Published schedules ensured coordination between multiple transportation companies competing for the same contracts. The American Trucking Association had officially classified Morrison's radical proposals as operationally unsound. Even military transportation officers questioned convoy modifications that violated established protocols developed through months of battlefield experience in European theater operations. But Morrison possessed the quiet confidence of a trucker who had been proven right before. As an independent operator since 1935, he had watched transportation experts resist innovations because change threatened established procedures. Flexible scheduling because unpredictability complicated logistics coordination. Variable routing because standard procedures simplified planning processes. Each time his practical experience had demolished their theoretical assumptions. Each time the industry had eventually followed where his results led. This time felt different. This time, America's war production hung in the balance. Morrison Freight Lines had invested everything in convoy methods that challenged fundamental assumptions about transportation security. 15 trucks, 37 employees, and contracts stretching from California defense plants to East Coast shipyards. The company that had delivered supplies for Golden Gate Bridge construction might not survive if Morrison's unconventional tactics proved wrong under wartime conditions, where failure meant strategic disaster rather than commercial disappointment. His reputation, built over 8 years of freight operations, rested on convoy techniques that used radio deception and route randomization to confuse theft rings that had infiltrated traditional transportation networks. The logistics were elegant in their complexity. Rather than traveling predictable routes in vulnerable formations, Morrison's convoys operated like naval task forces, using coded communications and coordinated deception to mask their true destinations while creating false targets that drew criminal attention away from actual cargo shipments. During departure procedures, when cargo security was most critical, convoys automatically scattered across multiple routes like military units, avoiding concentration that enemy forces could target effectively. At intermediate checkpoints, radio protocols shifted to encrypted frequencies that prevented surveillance while maintaining operational coordination. If criminal forces attempted interception, convoy elements could disperse into independent operations that eliminated the catastrophic losses that resulted when entire formations were compromised simultaneously. The numbers spoke with mathematical certainty. Morrison's field tests across Western transportation corridors had proven that distributed convoy operations could reduce cargo losses by 70%, extend operational security by eliminating predictable patterns, and improve delivery reliability by 45% across all route classifications. But numbers meant nothing if the transportation industry refused to implement tactics that violated every established protocol for convoy operations. The breakthrough came on March 15, 1943, when Pacific Maritime Commission gave Morrison Freight Lines one final opportunity: one test convoy carrying critical aluminum shipments from Alcoa facilities to Boeing assembly plants in Seattle. Test dispatcher Sarah Chen, a former logistics coordinator with ice water in her veins, would coordinate Morrison's impossible convoy system across the same western routes where traditional formations had suffered 60% losses during the previous month. Chen initiated departure procedures using Morrison's revolutionary communication protocols, broadcasting false departure times on standard frequencies, while actual convoy elements departed at staggered intervals through predetermined scatter patterns that eliminated the concentration vulnerabilities that theft rings exploited through conventional surveillance methods. 24 trucks carrying identical cargo markings departed Sacramento using 6 different routes, creating the appearance of normal convoy operations while implementing deception tactics that confused criminal intelligence networks that had infiltrated traditional transportation systems. The convoy elements maintained operational security through coded communications that shifted frequencies every 30 minutes, preventing the sustained surveillance that enabled theft rings to coordinate interception operations. Where traditional convoys announced their positions through predictable radio chatter, Morrison's system created false signals that led criminal forces toward empty highways, while actual cargo moved through alternative corridors, protected by operational deception rather than armed guards. By evening, preliminary reports confirmed what Morrison's logistics calculations had predicted. Traditional convoy formations had suffered their usual catastrophic losses, while his distributed system achieved 96% delivery success across identical territory during the same time period. The performance difference was so dramatic that Pacific Maritime Commission initially suspected Morrison's operation had received military escort protection rather than relying purely on tactical innovation. Commission Director Robert Hayes received the preliminary data by secure telephone that night. Morrison convoy system exceeds all performance projections. Recommend immediate evaluation for system-wide implementation. But as orders began flowing toward Morrison Freight Lines, a darker reality was emerging on the global stage. German U-boat operations had intensified Atlantic shipping interdiction. Japanese forces controlled Pacific supply routes. The convoy technology, initially designed for domestic transportation efficiency, was about to become America's secret weapon for maintaining strategic supply operations under conditions that conventional logistics had never imagined. The telephone rang in Morrison's Sacramento office on a humid May morning in 1943. The caller identified himself as Colonel James Mitchell from the Army Transportation Corps. They wanted to discuss strategic supply operations, critical materials that needed to reach defense plants regardless of enemy interdiction efforts. The age of logistics warfare was dawning, and Frank Morrison held the tactical keys that would unlock American supply superiority through methods that transportation experts had dismissed as impossibly complex. The convoy that departed Sacramento on May 18, 1943, looked like any other wartime freight operation to casual observers. 26 trucks loaded with aircraft aluminum, their drivers checking manifests and adjusting mirrors in the pre-dawn darkness. But beneath this facade of routine transportation procedure, Morrison had orchestrated something unprecedented in American logistics. Each driver carried sealed orders that wouldn't be opened until specific mileage markers, creating a web of uncertainty that made interception planning impossible for criminal organizations that had grown accustomed to predictable convoy behavior. Sarah Chen positioned herself in the communications center Morrison had established in a converted railcar, surrounded by radio equipment that hummed with electronic precision. Her Berkeley mathematics degree provided the analytical framework needed to coordinate deception operations across multiple time zones while maintaining the split-second timing that kept legitimate cargo moving through corridors where traditional convoys had become sitting targets for organized theft rings. The morning air carried the metallic scent of diesel exhaust and electrical equipment, familiar aromas that reminded her of the complex choreography required to make Morrison's system function under real-world conditions. "Beginning Phase 1 dispersal," Chen announced, her voice carrying the methodical tone of someone who understood that sloppy coordination meant strategic failure. The War Production Board demanded delivery statistics that could withstand scrutiny from Pentagon logistics officers who had never driven truck but possessed absolute authority over transportation resource allocation. Her slide rule moved with practiced efficiency as she calculated timing intervals that would scatter convoy elements across Nevada's highway network while maintaining the appearance of normal traffic flow to surveillance teams that monitored standard trucking routes. Morrison watched from his command vehicle as the first trucks disappeared into morning traffic, their destinations known only to sealed orders that transform predictable convoy operations into tactical puzzles that criminal intelligence networks couldn't solve through conventional surveillance methods. 8 years of independent trucking had taught him that successful freight operations depended on understanding enemy capabilities as much as cargo requirements. The theft rings that plagued Western transportation corridors operated with military discipline, using radio intercepts and route reconnaissance to coordinate attacks that devastated traditional convoy formations. But Morrison's distributed system eliminated the concentration vulnerabilities that made conventional convoys attractive targets for organized criminal operations. Instead of 26 trucks traveling together in formation, his cargo moved through 6 primary corridors and 12 alternate routes, creating logistical complexity that overwhelmed criminal planning capabilities while maintaining delivery coordination through coded communications that shifted frequencies faster than surveillance equipment could track effectively. The first test came at the Nevada-Utah border, where Highway Patrol reports had documented increasing criminal activity during the previous month. Traditional convoys approaching this checkpoint had suffered systematic interception as theft rings coordinated attacks through radio surveillance that revealed convoy timing, cargo manifests, and route selections with deadly precision. Morrison's trucks approached the same territory using staggered timing and false identification procedures that created the appearance of independent freight operations rather than coordinated convoy movements. Chen monitored progress through encrypted communications that revealed the elegant complexity of Morrison's tactical innovation. Truck 7 approaching Checkpoint Alpha using route classification Baker, she reported, her mathematics background providing context for operational procedures that looked chaotic to outside observers, but followed precise algorithms designed to maximize unpredictability while maintaining operational control. Radio discipline protocols prevent surveillance intercept, while coordination remains intact through frequency-shifting communications. The results exceeded Morrison's most optimistic projections. Criminal forces that had positioned themselves to intercept traditional convoy formations found themselves watching empty highways while actual cargo moved through alternative corridors, protected by operational deception rather than armed resistance. Intelligence networks that relied on predictable convoy behavior discovered that Morrison's system had eliminated the patterns they needed to coordinate successful interception operations. By noon, reports from field units confirmed what Morrison's tactical calculations had predicted. 0 cargo losses across all route classifications. Delivery times improved by 23% through elimination of security delays that plagued traditional convoy operations. Criminal interdiction attempts had failed completely because theft rings couldn't locate targets that moved through unpredictable patterns protected by communications security, rather than visible escort forces. Colonel Mitchell observed the operation from Morrison's communications center, his military bearing unable to completely mask growing excitement about tactical innovations that solved logistics problems the Army Transportation Corps had considered unsolvable through conventional methods. 2 decades of military service had conditioned him to respect established transportation doctrine. But the results emerging from Nevada's highway network challenged fundamental assumptions about convoy security that had shaped Army logistics planning since mechanized warfare began. If civilian freight operations can achieve this level of security through tactical deception, Mitchell said, understanding that these principles could transform military supply operations under combat conditions where predictable logistics meant tactical disaster. Enemy forces that rely on convoy interdiction would face the same targeting problems that criminal organizations encountered when confronting Morrison's distributed system. The afternoon brought more dramatic validation as competing convoy operations using traditional security methods suffered their predictable, catastrophic losses. Western freight lines reported 40% cargo losses on identical routes during the same time period. Mountain States Trucking documented complete convoy destruction near the Colorado border. Continental Express suspended operations after criminal forces intercepted 3 consecutive shipments using radio surveillance that revealed convoy movements with precision that bordered on military intelligence gathering. Meanwhile, Morrison's distributed elements continued their invisible progress across Western highway networks, their success masked by operational deception that made extraordinary results appear routine to casual observation. Chen's coordination protocols maintained perfect delivery synchronization while creating false radio signatures that led criminal surveillance teams toward empty routes where phantom convoys existed only in carefully orchestrated communications designed to waste enemy resources on non-productive interdiction attempts. The psychological impact on criminal organizations became apparent through law enforcement intercepts that revealed growing frustration among theft ring coordinators who had built successful operations around predictable convoy behavior. Morrison's system had eliminated the intelligence gathering opportunities that enabled criminal forces to plan effective attacks against traditional freight operations. Without predictable targets, organized theft rings faced the same strategic paralysis that military forces experienced when confronting enemies that refused to operate according to established tactical patterns. The technological breakthrough that made everything possible was elegant in its operational simplicity. Morrison's communications system used standard trucking radio equipment, configured through frequency coordination protocols that created secure communications without requiring specialized military hardware. A timing mechanism, no larger than a pocket watch, maintained operational synchronization regardless of route variations by automatically adjusting coordination schedules based on real-time traffic conditions. When convoy elements encountered unexpected delays, the system automatically shifted coordination timing to prevent operational gaps that criminal forces could exploit through surveillance. During normal operations, communications protocols maintained perfect coordination while broadcasting false information that led criminal intelligence networks away from actual cargo movements. Most revolutionary was the deception capability. If criminal forces attempted systematic surveillance, coordinated false communications could create phantom convoys that drew interdiction efforts toward predetermined kill zones, where law enforcement agencies waited to dismantle theft ring operations. For freight companies operating through territory controlled by organized criminal forces, this single capability could mean the difference between commercial survival and bankruptcy through systematic cargo losses that traditional security methods couldn't prevent effectively. The performance improvements were undeniable when translated into strategic transportation capability. A Morrison convoy versus traditional formation using identical cargo and routes showed dramatic differences across every operational metric. Cargo loss rates dropped from 60% to less than 4%. Delivery reliability improved by 45% through elimination of security delays. transportation costs decreased by 30% through reduced insurance requirements and eliminated escort expenses. Most significantly, operational security improved by orders of magnitude as criminal intelligence networks discovered they could no longer predict convoy movements through conventional surveillance methods that had proven effective against traditional transportation operations. But numbers on operational reports meant nothing if the system failed when truckers needed it most. Morrison's obsession with reliability drove him to test every protocol beyond its design limits. Communication procedures were subjected to interference 50% stronger than maximum enemy jamming capabilities. Timing coordination operated continuously for 72-hour periods at temperature extremes from 20 degrees below zero to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Radio encryption was tested with signal contamination that simulated enemy electronic warfare and equipment failure under combat-level stress conditions. The resistance from established transportation companies grew more vocal as Morrison Freight Line's success rates attracted attention from War Production Board procurement officers. Allied Van Lines, operators of the largest conventional convoy system in the western states, launched a lobbying campaign arguing that distributed operations were an unnecessary complication that would cost American drivers their lives when criminal forces adapted to new tactical realities. Their chief logistics coordinator, Dr. Martha Hendricks, published industry papers questioning whether frequency-shifting communications could operate reliably in mountainous terrain, where radio propagation created dead zones and atmospheric interference disrupted coordination protocols. Morrison answered with more data. His high-altitude tests at 8,000 feet proved that distributed convoy systems actually performed better in challenging terrain because multiple communication pathways provided redundant coordination channels that eliminated the single-point failures that plagued traditional convoy radio networks. Interference tests showed that frequency-shifting protocols suffered fewer communication breakdowns than fixed-frequency systems because automatic channel selection eliminated the resonance problems that disrupted standard trucking communications during adverse weather conditions. The breakthrough moment came during a demonstration at Donner Pass on June 3, 1943. Two identical freight operations departed simultaneously from Sacramento, one using standard convoy procedures, the other implementing Morrison's distributed tactical system. The performance difference was so dramatic that observing transportation officials initially suspected Morrison's operation had received undisclosed military support rather than relying purely on innovative logistics coordination. Traditional convoy formation reached Reno with 40% cargo losses after criminal forces intercepted the predictable formation using standard surveillance methods that had proven effective against conventional transportation operations for months. Morrison's distributed elements achieved 98% delivery success across identical territory during the same time period, with cargo losses limited to a single vehicle breakdown that resulted from mechanical failure rather than criminal interdiction. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, who would later command strategic supply operations for Pacific Theater Forces, filed a report that evening recommending immediate adoption of distributed convoy protocols for all critical military transportation requirements. The operational advantage, she wrote, represents a fundamental shift in logistics capability. Any supply system equipped with Morrison's coordination methods will possess decisive superiority over opponents using conventional interdiction tactics, designed to exploit predictable convoy behavior. As summer 1943 progressed, Morrison's communications center operated around the clock to coordinate convoy operations that stretched across multiple time zones. But in Washington, darker events were unfolding that would test his innovations under conditions no peacetime trucker could have imagined. Intelligence reports from European theatre described German interdiction tactics that made domestic criminal operations look like amateur harassment compared to systematic military campaigns designed to destroy Allied supply capabilities through coordinated attacks on predictable logistics networks. While Frank Morrison refined his convoy techniques in Nevada, European transportation operations lagged dangerously behind American tactical innovation. In occupied France, resistance supply networks still relied on predetermined routes that German intelligence services tracked with mathematical precision. British convoy operations through submarine-infested Atlantic corridors use formation tactics that U-boat commanders exploited through positioning strategies that turned Allied predictability into tactical advantages for enemy forces. The deadly consequences of conventional logistics became apparent during supply operations supporting Italian campaign preparations. Allied transportation reports from July 1943 painted a grim picture that kept Pentagon logistics officers working through sleepless nights, analysing failure patterns that threatened strategic objectives across multiple theatres of operation. German interdiction forces consistently achieved 70% success rates against Allied supply convoys that operated according to established military transportation doctrine. Supply officers reported mission failures when convoys couldn't reach forward positions without suffering catastrophic losses that eliminated combat effectiveness before tactical operations could begin. Transportation commanders lost precious time during supply runs to forward bases, time that often meant the difference between maintaining defensive positions or watching helplessly as German forces exploited logistics failures to achieve tactical breakthroughs through sustained offensive operations. General Omar Bradley, the methodical strategist who would command American ground forces during the coming invasion of Europe, privately worried that Allied logistics were technologically outmatched against German interdiction capabilities that operated with systematic efficiency. Intelligence reports from North African operations described enemy tactics that could optimize interdiction effectiveness throughout extended campaigns, while Allied supply officers struggled with coordination methods that demanded constant attention during the precise moments when focus should remain on tactical requirements rather than administrative procedures. At the 1943 National Transportation Conference in Chicago, Morrison presented operational data that should have alarmed every military logistics expert in attendance. His comparison of distributed versus conventional convoy performance using identical routes revealed statistics that bordered on revolutionary. Cargo delivery success rates were 85% higher with tactical deception protocols. Supply reliability below critical thresholds increased by 60%. Fuel consumption for security operations dropped by 40%. Most significantly, interdiction resistance increased by more than 300%, giving properly coordinated supply systems decisive operational advantage over criminal forces that relied on predictable convoy behavior to coordinate successful attacks. Yet European military transportation experts dismissed these figures as civilian applications with military disadvantages that would prove fatal under combat conditions, where enemy forces possessed capabilities that exceeded criminal organization resources by orders of magnitude. General Heinrich Schmidt, coordinator of German supply interdiction operations, publicly argued that distributed convoy systems represented American tactical over-engineering that sacrificed coordination reliability for marginal security gains that would collapse under systematic military pressure. British logistics commanders echoed these concerns, insisting that traditional convoy formations provided commanders with more direct control during combat supply operations, where tactical flexibility meant survival under conditions that civilian transportation had never encountered. The production challenge facing Morrison's operation grew more complex with each passing month as military contracts multiplied beyond civilian transportation industry capacity. Each distributed convoy required 23 precise coordination protocols, with timing tolerances measured in minutes rather than hours, plus communication procedures that demanded skilled operators working with specialized equipment under conditions that eliminated margin for error. Morrison's Sacramento facility expanded to coordinate operations across 4 time zones, operating continuously 7 days per week. But demand consistently exceeded coordination capacity as Army Transportation Corps, Navy Logistics Commands, and Allied procurement commissions competed for limited convoy services that had proven capable of delivering critical supplies through territory where conventional operations had become predictably vulnerable to organized interdiction efforts. Quality control became Morrison's obsession and his operational nightmare. A single batch of faulty radio crystals, the critical components that regulated frequency-shifting communications, caused coordination failures across 3 convoy operations during high-priority supply runs to West Coast defense plants. The failures occurred during peak operational periods, exactly the conditions where communication reliability was most essential for maintaining tactical deception that protected cargo from criminal interdiction. War Production Board procurement officers threatened to cancel pending contracts worth $2.8 million. Critics throughout the transportation industry seized on these incidents as proof that distributed convoy systems were too complex for combat conditions, where operational simplicity equaled mission success under circumstances that eliminated second chances for coordination failures. Morrison's response demonstrated the methodical determination that had driven his trucking career since 1935. Working with a team of his best dispatchers and radio operators, he redesigned the communication protocols in 4 weeks, implementing redundant frequency networks and backup coordination channels that would maintain basic convoy function even if primary communication systems failed completely under enemy jamming or equipment damage. New testing procedures subjected every radio system to interference levels that exceeded combat conditions by 75%. Most significantly, Morrison instituted a policy of personally monitoring and approving every critical convoy operation that carried strategic materials for military production facilities. The reliability improvements came at a critical moment. By autumn 1943, German U-boat strength had grown to over 400 operational submarines, while Allied convoy losses in the Atlantic approached 30% of all strategic materials shipped to European theatre operations. Enemy interdiction capabilities were accelerating rapidly with new tactical innovations that exploited predictable Allied logistics patterns like military intelligence operations designed to maximize supply disruption through systematic targeting of conventional transportation networks. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces possessed the coordination and tactical flexibility to interdict any predictable supply operation, while Allied logistics struggled to maintain delivery schedules through territory controlled by enemy forces that understood how to exploit conventional convoy vulnerabilities with devastating effectiveness. The technological disparity became tragically apparent during Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. Morrison's distributed convoy principles remained largely absent from military supply operations, victims of bureaucratic resistance and institutional adherence to transportation doctrine that prioritized theoretical control over practical results. Supply officers who had studied his Nevada demonstrations understood better than most what Allied forces faced in the coming Mediterranean campaign. Having coordinated freight operations against organized criminal networks, Morrison knew that military interdiction wasn't fundamentally different from civilian theft rings, just better organized and more systematically destructive. The mathematics were brutally similar. Predictable convoy movements created targeting opportunities that enemy forces exploited through intelligence gathering, while unpredictable logistics eliminated the patterns required for successful interdiction operations. Morrison stood in his Sacramento Communications Center on August 3, 1943, monitoring radio intercepts that confirmed his tactical fears. German reconnaissance aircraft were tracking Allied supply convoys with mathematical precision, coordinating submarine positions and air attacks that devastated shipping operations following established military transportation protocols. Within days, perhaps hours, Operation Husky would depend on supply lines that moved according to patterns enemy forces had learned to exploit with systematic efficiency. The solution existed in American trucking innovations, but military bureaucracy moved with institutional slowness while German interdiction preparations accelerated through coordination networks that treated Allied predictability as strategic intelligence rather than operational necessity. Morrison bypassed normal procurement channels and placed direct calls to Mediterranean theatre logistics commanders, offering to demonstrate distributed supply coordination under actual combat conditions regardless of official authorization or procedural requirements. The conversion program began within 72 hours, operating under emergency classification from Joint Chiefs of Staff authorization. Morrison's team worked around the clock in requisitioned facilities at Norfolk Naval Base, training military supply officers in frequency-shifting communications and tactical deception protocols that eliminated the predictable patterns enemy forces required for successful interdiction operations. Each conversion required 16 hours of intensive coordination training, removing traditional convoy procedures, installing distributed communication networks, calibrating timing protocols, and conducting operational tests to ensure proper function under combat stress conditions. Military commands could spare personnel for only 48-hour training periods, creating logistical nightmares where supply operations functioned with reduced coordination capability, while their officers underwent emergency tactical modification that challenged fundamental assumptions about military transportation doctrine. The first converted supply convoy departed Norfolk on August 8, 1943. Colonel Martinez personally supervised the initial operational test, coordinating departure procedures using Morrison's revolutionary deception protocols, rather than standard military convoy formation. The improvement was immediately apparent during coordination phases. Distributed elements scattered across multiple departure times and routes, eliminating the concentration vulnerabilities that enemy reconnaissance exploited through systematic surveillance of conventional military supply operations. Where previous convoys had announced their movements through predictable radio communications and formation patterns, the modified operation created tactical uncertainty that made interdiction planning impossible for enemy forces that relied on Allied predictability to coordinate successful attacks. The real validation came during transit through submarine-controlled waters, where German U-boat commanders had achieved devastating success against conventional Allied convoy formations. Martinez coordinated supply elements through dispersed routing that eliminated the target concentration enemy forces needed for effective torpedo attacks. At predetermined coordination points, distributed elements maintained perfect operational timing, while broadcasting false communications that led German surveillance toward empty ocean corridors where phantom convoys existed, only in carefully orchestrated radio deception. The tactical implications were staggering. Allied military logistics had been planning Mediterranean operations based on supply systems that suffered 30% losses to enemy interdiction and required massive escort resources that diverted combat vessels from offensive operations. Suddenly, strategic supplies could move through enemy-controlled territory with loss rates below 3%, while eliminating escort requirements that had consumed destroyer and corvette resources needed for tactical operations against German naval forces. Martinez coordinated supply delivery through enemy interdiction zones that had previously been considered too dangerous for conventional convoy operations. Her operational report was direct and urgent. Distributed supply protocols have eliminated predictable targeting opportunities that enemy forces exploit through systematic surveillance. Request immediate implementation across all Mediterranean logistics operations. Within 96 hours, supply commands throughout European theatre had begun implementing Morrison's coordination methods. Military logistics officers' reactions ranged from professional amazement to institutional disbelief as they discovered operational capabilities they had never imagined possible through conventional transportation doctrine. Major Thomas Richardson, veteran of North African supply operations, described the transformation in his classified operational diary. Enemy interdiction success has dropped from 70% to negligible levels across all supply corridors. German forces cannot coordinate attacks against targets they cannot predict or locate through conventional reconnaissance methods. For the first time since Mediterranean operations began, Allied logistics possessed decisive tactical advantage over enemy interdiction capabilities. Similar conversions began immediately across Pacific theatre supply networks. Morrison's coordination specialists worked 20-hour shifts to retrofit military logistics with distributed protocols before Japanese interdiction forces adapted their tactics to counter Allied innovations that eliminated predictable targeting opportunities enemy commanders had exploited throughout early Pacific campaigns. The numbers that would secure Allied victory were becoming operational reality across global supply networks. By October 1943, 85% of critical military logistics incorporated Morrison's distributed coordination methods. Combat supply reports from Mediterranean and Pacific operations documented dramatic improvements in strategic delivery capabilities that transformed Allied logistical effectiveness from vulnerable liability into decisive tactical advantage. The war ended with Frank Morrison's impossible convoy system moving 94% of Allied strategic materials through enemy territory that had previously claimed half of all supply operations. Statistical analysis conducted by the War Department in 1946 revealed that distributed logistics had directly prevented an estimated 40,000 supply mission failures through unpredictable routing that eliminated targeting opportunities, coordinated deception that overwhelmed enemy surveillance capabilities, and tactical flexibility that maintained delivery schedules despite systematic interdiction attempts. Morrison's trucking innovation, dismissed by transportation experts as operationally unsound, had proven more reliable under combat conditions than the conventional convoy formations it replaced. The methodology that critics claimed would cost American lives had instead secured Allied victory by transforming predictable supply vulnerability into strategic advantage through tactical deception that enemy forces never learned to counter effectively.